The new legislation repeals mandatory minimum sentences for most drug and some firearms offences, but mandatory minimums remain on the books for murder, sexual offences, and impaired driving. Senator Kim Pate says mandatory minimum sentences as a whole don't achieve their goal and disproportionately target minority groups such as Indigenous women.
The reality is, if mandatory minimum penalties made us safer, then the United States should be the safest place in the world. And if implementing them is soft on crime, then show us the evidence that jailing more and more Indigenous women and putting more and more of their kids in state care is going to make us safer.
Jonathan Rudin of Aboriginal Legal Services agrees mandatory minimums don't make the streets any safer.
There's no evidence that mandatory minimums make communities safer or deter crime, but they do disproportionately have an impact on Indigenous people, and they do lead to even more of the mass incarceration of Indigenous people that we see.
Rudin says these sentences particularly miss the mark in cases of Indigenous women who may be in situations of long-term abuse and responding in self-defense.
First and second degree murder convictions for women who often are responding to violence. Again, do we necessarily need to have a mandatory minimum? Does it have to be 10, 25 years? No. So there are, and similarly with some of the firearms offenses that are still there, what happens when you're in court on a regular basis is you see all these exceptions.
Kat Owens with Women's Legal Education and Action Fund also says by keeping some mandatory minimum sentences in place, women will continue to plead guilty to crimes they don't want to.
If you're facing criminal charges and there's a mandatory minimum penalty involved, it does change the sort of calculation of risk that you do when deciding whether or not to plead guilty to a particular offense. And it gives prosecutors a lot of power to push for guilty pleas for someone to a lesser offense that might not have a mandatory minimum.
Pate and others in the Senate had tried to amend Bill C-5 so judges could override mandatory minimum sentences in exceptional circumstances. But this amendment was defeated. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.